Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Monday, June 3rd, 2024. Dr. Anthony Fauci testifies before Congress about the response to the COVID-19 pandemic for the first time since leaving as the longtime leader of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He denies accusations that he tried to suppress discussion that the virus was leaked from a lab. Federal criminal trial of Hunter Biden, son of President Joe Biden, begins with jury selection. Hunter Biden is facing charges that he lied about illegal drug use when buying and possessing a firearm. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer schedules a vote this week to guarantee the right to contraception. The winner of Sunday's presidential election in Mexico is apparently Claudia Sheinbaum, who is from the same party as the outgoing president. We'll talk about how this new president will approach U.S. Mexico relations with USA Today Immigration and Border reporter Lauren Villagran. White House spokesperson John Kirby is asked about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not sounding like he is totally on board with the ceasefire plan that President Biden outlined on Friday and said was offered by Israel. And White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan asked at a foreign policy forum in Washington about the priorities of a potential second Biden presidential term. He talks about helping the developing world. New York Times writes that Dr. Anthony S. Fauci, the former government scientist, both celebrated and despised for his work on COVID, on Monday forcefully denied Republican allegations that he sought to cover up the possibility that the pandemic originated in a laboratory, calling the accusation absolutely false and simply preposterous. In a tense appearance before the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic, Dr. Fauci read out an email from February 2020 in which he encouraged the scientist worried about the possibility of a lab leak to report his concerns to the FBI. That was from the New York Times. Here's part of Dr. Fauci's opening statement.
The first issue concerns my actions regarding the possibility that SARS-CoV-2 might have resulted from a lab leak. On January 31st, 2020, I was informed through phone calls with Jeremy Farrar, then director of the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and then with Christian Anderson, a highly regarded scientist at Scripps Research Institute, that they and Eddie Holmes, a world-class evolutionary biologist from Australia, were concerned that the genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 suggested that the virus could have been manipulated in a lab. I participated in a conference call the next day with about a dozen international virologists to discuss this possibility versus a spillover from an animal reservoir. The discussion was lively, with arguments for both possibilities. Two participants have testified before this subcommittee that I did not try to steer the discussion in any direction. It was decided that several participants would more carefully examine the genomic sequence. After this further examination, several who at first were concerned about lab manipulation became convinced that the virus was not deliberately manipulated. They concluded that the most likely scenario was a spillover from an animal reservoir, although they still kept an open mind. They appropriately published their opinion in the peer-reviewed literature. The accusation being circulated that I influenced these scientists to change their minds by bribing them with millions of dollars in grant money is absolutely false and simply preposterous. I had no input into the content of the published paper. The second issue is a false accusation that I tried to cover up the possibility that the virus originated from a lab. In fact, the truth is exactly the opposite. I now quote from an email that I sent to Professor Farrar on February 1, 2020, quote, Jeremy, I just got off the phone with Christian Anderson, and he related to me his concern about the furin site mutation in the spike protein of the virus. I told him that as soon as possible, he and Eddie Holmes should get a group of evolutionary biologists together to carefully examine the data to determine if his concerns are validated, and they should report it to the appropriate authorities. I would imagine that in the USA, this would be the FBI, and in the UK, it would be MI5. In the meantime, I will alert my U.S. government official colleagues of my conversation with you and Christian and determine what further investigation they recommend. Let us stay in touch. Best regards, Tony, unquote. It is inconceivable that anyone who reads this email could conclude that I was trying to cover up the possibility of a lab leak. I have always kept an open mind to the different possibilities.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, testifying today before a House committee. He also responded to an email exchange between a former senior advisor, Dr. David Morenz, and an executive of a virus research organization where the advisor claims that Fauci's private Gmail account could be utilized to evade Freedom of Information Act and future public scrutiny. Dr. Fauci saying today, let me state for the record that to the best of my knowledge, I have never conducted official business via my personal email. Here's some of the Q&A from today's hearing. Congresswoman Debbie Lesko, Republican from Arizona, asking Dr. Fauci about the funding given to a lab in Wuhan, China, where COVID-19 was first identified.
Did the National Institute of Health fund the potentially dangerous enhanced potential pandemic pathogens gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I would not characterize it the way you did. The National Institutes of Health, through a sub-award to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, funded research on the surveillance of and the possibility of emerging infections. I would not characterize it as dangerous gain-of-function research. I've already testified to that effect a couple of times.
So you're saying no, correct? In his May 16th,
I'm saying no because I've said no multiple times, including on the transcribed interview.
In his May 16th, 2024 testimony, the NIH Deputy Director Tabak said, and I quote, I can tell you that the failure of the Wuhan Institute of Virology to provide us with the data that we requested and the lab notebooks that we requested certainly impeded our ability to understand what was really going on with the experiments that we have been discussing this morning. My question to you, Dr. Fauci, if the NIH didn't inspect the Wuhan Institute of Virology and NIH didn't receive the lab books and data from China and the required reports from EcoHealth Alliance were not submitted, in fact, they were late, how can you definitively say that the NIH did not fund the dangerous gain-of-function research?
I go back to what I said, that the gain-of-function research by the operative and regulatory definition of P3CO does not include at all the viruses that were studied under the sub-award.
How do you know that, sir, if there was no lab books, nothing from China?
We know what viruses they were studying.
How? How do you know? You never went there.
I'm telling you that the NIH funded research on these viruses. If someone else somewhere in China was doing something else.
Well, and that's the problem, because NIH didn't go there. You didn't get the reports that were needed. How in the world would you know? I'm going to go on to the next question.
And you're not hearing what I'm saying.
Dr. Anthony Fauci testifying before a committee today, questioned by Congresswoman Debbie Lesko, Republican from Arizona. Many other topics were brought up by members of Congress, including the 6-foot social distancing during the pandemic and mask and vaccine mandates. And ABC News puts it this way, tensions boiled over when Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of Fauci's most passionate detractors, said his license should be revoked and he should be imprisoned. She was stopped by Chair Congressman Brad Wenstrup, a fellow Republican, because of a lack of decorum. Democrats defended Fauci in the aftermath, with Congressman Robert Garcia calling Greene's comments completely irresponsible. That was from ABC News. Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, Democrat from Michigan, asked Dr. Fauci about threats he and his family have faced.
Dr. Fauci, can you please share with us the nature of the threats you have received since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, there have been everything from harassments by emails, texts, letters of myself, my wife, my 3 daughters. There have been credible death threats leading to the arrests of 2 individuals, and credible death threats mean someone who clearly was on their way to kill me. And it's required my having protective services essentially all the time. It is very troublesome to me. It is much more troublesome because they've involved my wife and my 3 daughters.
At these moments, how do you feel? Keep your mic on.
Terrible.
Do you continue to receive threats today?
Yes, I do. Every time someone gets up and says I'm responsible for the death of people throughout the world, the death threats go up.
It's unacceptable that you've been treated this way, especially after you've dedicated your life to science and research for the public interest. You deserve better. Every human being deserves better. And I'm afraid that the treatment you've received will also have far-reaching consequences for the future of science, particularly when done for the public good.
Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, Democrat from Michigan, questioning Dr. Anthony Fauci, who led the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for almost 4 decades before retiring in 2022. TheHill.com reporting on today's hearing, Dr. Fauci said if the U.S. hadn't put in place any COVID-19 interventions and let the virus run rampant, there very likely would have been another 1 million people who have died. You can find the full video of this hearing, runs about 3.5 hours, at our video library, cspan.org. Jury selection began today in the federal trial of Hunter Biden, President Joe Biden's son, who was accused of lying about his illegal drug use when he bought and kept a firearm in 2018. Hunter Biden has pleaded not guilty. First Lady Jill Biden was in the courtroom in Wilmington, Delaware, seated in the front row. President Biden putting out a written statement. I am the president, but I am also a dad. Jill and I love our son, and we are so proud of the man he is today. Hunter's resilience in the face of adversity and the strength he has brought to his recovery are inspiring to us. A lot of families have loved ones who have overcome addiction and know what we mean. As the president, I don't and won't comment on pending federal cases, but as a dad, I have boundless love for our son, confidence in him, and respect for his strength. C-SPAN spoke with Reuters reporter Tom Halls this morning as he was in line to go into the courtroom to cover the case.
Hunter Biden's charged with 2 overlapping charges related to his a background form in which he ticked the box for no next to whether he was an unlawful user of a controlled substance when he bought his handgun. So he bought a gun in 2018. He bought a Colt Cobra 38 Special here in Wilmington. He said on the form he was not an unlawful user of drugs or illegal drugs. And then he's also charged separately with possessing that gun illegally. He only had the gun for 11 days. His brother's beau, who had died at the time, his beau's wife, Hallie, had taken the gun and thrown it away. And so since then, there was this long investigation of Hunter Biden, and eventually these are one of the charges, a group of charges that came out of that. He's also separately charged with tax crimes in Los Angeles. That's a separate trial. This has nothing to do with Burisma or the laptop or anything like that. And they're going to try to prove at trial over the next week or 2 that he was an unlawful user, knowingly an unlawful user of drugs, and lied on his background form. And he faces up to 25 years in prison.
And what has Hunter Biden's defense attorneys said about this case, and what sort of evidence are they expected to be confronted with?
Yeah, they've tried to frame this as as politics. They've tried to inject Trump into the case by saying, it was Donald Trump and Republicans bringing pressure on U.S. Special Counsel David Weiss to bring these charges. You might remember last summer there was a plea deal in which Hunter Biden was going to plead to misdemeanor tax crimes, and he was going to avoid punishment for the gun crimes at a hearing last summer. That fell apart when the judge in this case, Mary Ellen Norica, questioned if the plea deal was too broad, was offering Hunter Biden way too much immunity for what he was actually alleged to have done. And after that, it kind of was put on track towards trial as the only other way to resolve this. Biden's legal team has also raised defenses that, he may not have realized he was a drug addict or user at the time he bought the gun. He may have thought of himself as rehabilitated. He had come through a rehabilitation program shortly before he bought the gun. They've also kind of made the argument that, he wasn't actually using drugs the day he bought the gun. I think is kind of another aspect they've kind of kicked around. They've also raised some questions about some of the evidence that's been put on the record by the prosecutors. Some of it's been, there's kind of one infamous instance where the prosecutors entered as an exhibit a picture of what Hunter Biden's legal team says was sawdust, putting the lines as if it was cocaine. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
During the Trump trial, the hush money trial, there was a parade of high-profile witnesses. Who's expected to be on the stand, and is Hunter Biden expected to take the stand in this trial?
I think any good defense lawyer will tell you it always just depends how things are going before they put their client on the stand. So we'll see if Hunter Biden testifies. Certainly his legal team has suggested he might. But the prosecutors have said they plan to call his ex-wife during divorce proceedings in 2017. Hunter Biden's ex-wife complained a lot in court documents about Hunter's spending money on alcohol and drugs and prostitutes. So she may take the stand, and also they may call Beau Biden, that was Hunter Biden's older brother who died of cancer in 2015. They may call Beau Biden's wife, or I guess ex-wife, Hallie Biden. Hunter and Hallie had a romantic relationship, and she was the one who actually threw the gun away, took it out of Hunter Biden's car and threw it away. She said she was worried that he would harm himself, which is why she removed the gun from his car. And there may be other romantic partners taking the stand as the prosecution makes their case that he was, a knowing drug user at the time.
Reuters reporter Tom Halls interviewed by C-SPAN this morning as he was waiting to go into the courtroom in Wilmington, Delaware, to cover the Hunter Biden trial. And by the end of the day, a jury of 12 and 4 alternates was seated in this trial, picked from about 250 prospective jurors. During that selection process, Washington Post reporting that the jurors filled out a questionnaire and the judge asking a few follow-ups of people who answered yes on some of the questions as she tried to whittle down the pool. Questions so far, writes the Post, focusing on people's personal schedules, their views on gun ownership, and any family history they have with drug addiction. From CNN, 8 Senate Republicans led by Mike Lee of Utah are vowing to oppose major legislation and Biden nominees led by the Democratic Senate, following guilty verdicts for former President Donald Trump in New York. The move could further bring legislative activity in the upper chamber to a slog. Specifically, the GOP lawmakers said they would oppose any increase in non-security related funding, Biden judicial and political nominations, and expedited consideration and passage of Democratic legislation. That was from CNN. One of the signers to that letter, Roger Marshall of Kansas, was interviewed by Fox News on Saturday.
I think everybody across the world is looking at this mockery and saying the President of the United States took the blindfold off of Lady Justice and then he threw her underneath a speeding bus. He did not have an opportunity to defend himself, not when a judge, like he had in this particular trial, put their total weight on the scale.
Well, you are one of the signers of a Senate letter that suggests you don't want to cooperate with the Biden administration on anything that doesn't involve the safety and security of the American people as a result of this conviction. There it is. You're one of the 8 U.S. senators who have signed it. What's the purpose here?
Right. So we've seen Joe Biden make a mockery of our legal system, and we are going to fight fire with fire. We are going to grind the Senate to a halt as best we are going to fight against every one of his political nominations, every one of his judges that he's nominating, any type of his agenda we can. We're going to slow it down as best possible. There's something called unanimous consent, and that's how about 90% of the legislation gets through the Senate. We're going to do everything we can to throw the brakes on this. Look, what Joe Biden did was election interference by attacking his chief political rival, keeping him from out there campaigning. Just the timing of all this is atrocious, so we're going to fight fire with fire. I want to give Senator Mike Lee from the great state of Utah a lot of credit for leading this letter as well, so we look forward to fighting fire with fire.
Senator Roger Marshall, Republican from Kansas, on Fox News on Saturday, and the other signers of the letter are Mike Lee of Utah, J.D. Vance of Ohio, Tommy Tuberville of Alabama, Eric Schmidt from Missouri, Martha Blackburn of Tennessee, Rick Scott of Florida, and Marco Rubio, also from Florida. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, spoke on the Senate floor today about the guilty verdict in the Donald Trump hush money trial last week.
Last Thursday, a jury found former President Donald Trump guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records as part of a hush money scheme. Former President Donald Trump is now a convicted felon. The most important takeaway from this case is that nobody's above the law, including Donald Trump. The former president went through the same legal process that all Americans go through. He was tried according to the facts and the law and was found guilty by a jury of his peers. As Donald Trump considers his next steps, there should continue to be no outside political influence, intimidation, or interference in the case. I encourage Mr. Trump's supporters and critics alike to let the process move forward according to law.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor. The senator also talked about the agenda this week. TheHill.com writes that Senator Schumer has announced in a Dear Colleague letter the Senate will vote Wednesday on the Right to Contraception Act, timing the vote shortly before the 2-year anniversary of the Supreme Court decision striking down the right to an abortion. Schumer opened his letter by noting that June 24th will mark the 2-year anniversary of the court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, and that at least 20 states have now near total bans or severe restrictions on abortion. That was from The Hill. Here's Senator Schumer today.
This month, America marks a dark and somber anniversary. 2 years since a radical MAGA majority on the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. The decision to overturn Roe will go down as one of the worst Supreme Court cases in modern times. It will be remembered as one of the most draconian reversals of individual liberty in American history. There should be no question who brought our country to this crisis. It was Donald Trump and hard-right Republicans, who have made clear that they will not rest until freedom of choice is eliminated across the country. Democrats will not stand for Republicans' relentless attacks on reproductive freedoms. This week, the Senate will begin our defense of freedom of choice with a vote to protect access to contraceptives. Before the Memorial Day process, I began the process. Before the Memorial Day holiday, I began the process for the Senate to consider the Right to Contraception Act, led by Senators Markey and Hirono. Today, I just filed cloture on the motion to proceed to that bill. Members should expect a vote moving forward on the Right to Contraception Act on Wednesday. Federal protections for contraceptives is a critical piece of protecting Americans' women's reproductive freedoms. And this legislation would codify the right to contraception into federal law. For those who think that federal protections for birth control are unnecessary, just look at what's happening at the state level. Republican governors in Virginia and Nevada have already vetoed bills to protect birth control. And the Arizona legislature has blocked similar bills too. The federal government should absolutely have a say in ensuring every American has access to birth control if they need it. And there will be more action to come after that. Over the coming weeks, Senate Democrats will put reproductive freedoms front and center before this chamber, so that the American people can see for themselves who will stand up to defend their fundamental liberties.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor. A story from Axios says that Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas wrote in a concurring opinion overturning Roe v. Wade that the bench should reconsider, quote, all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including those guaranteeing birth control access and marriage equality. Story today from the New Jersey Globe. The Globe has learned that Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, will enter the race for the U.S. Senate today, filing nominating petitions with over 2,000 signatures in Trenton to seek re-election to a fourth term as an independent. Menendez will not deliver the petitions himself. He is in Lower Manhattan for the 12th day of his federal corruption trial. He will have a friend deliver them to the State Division of Elections. The filing deadline is June 4th at 4 p.m. Eastern. That was from the New Jersey Globe. Wall Street today, the Dow down 115, NASDAQ up 93, S&P up 5. Washington today continues in a moment.
The House will be in order.
This year, C-SPAN celebrates 45 years of covering Congress like no other. Since 1979, we've been your primary source for Capitol Hill, providing balanced, unfiltered coverage of government, taking you to where the policy's debated and decided, all with the support of America's cable companies. C-SPAN, 45 years and counting, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. That's a free app. From CNN, Claudia Sheinbaum has responded to an announcement of her projected victory in Mexico's presidential election early Monday morning, saying her administration would govern all Mexicans without distinction, even though not everyone supports her policies. She told supporters in a speech, "Our duty is and will always be to look after every single Mexican without distinction, so even though many Mexicans do not fully agree with our project, we will have to walk in peace and harmony to continue building a fair and more prosperous Mexico." She also spoke about the historical significance of becoming the first female president of the country, saying, "I am also grateful because for the first time in 200 years of the Republic, I will become the first woman president of Mexico." Sheinbaum won between 58.3% and 60.7% of the vote, according to the National Election Quick Count, a statistical method that predicts the trend in voting from a random sample of polling stations. The Electoral Court must validate the presidential election, and if confirmed, Sheinbaum will start her presidency on October 1st. That was from CNN. White House spokesperson John Kirby talked to reporters about this.
We congratulate Claudia Sheinbaum on her historic election as the first woman president of Mexico. President Biden and the team look forward to working closely with President-elect Sheinbaum and her team. As noted in the president's statement that we released this morning, we're committed to advancing the values and interests of both our nations to the benefit of our peoples. We also congratulate the Mexican people, of course, for conducting a nationwide successful democratic electoral process involving races for more than 20,000 different positions at the local, state, and federal levels. Quite an achievement, and we congratulate them on that.
John Kirby is White House National Security Communications Advisor, part of a virtual audio news conference today. At the State Department, spokesperson Matthew Miller was asked how the election of Claudia Sheinbaum will affect U.S. Mexico relations when it comes to immigration policy.
And on Mexico, again, I know there's a statement issued, but with AMLO, there are quite a few arrangements on migration that have taken place. Is it the understanding that these will continue on with the new administration? Do you anticipate any type of shakeup in terms of the migration protocols with?
So I think we'll let the new president, the president-elect, take office before we start talking about specific policies, but we do expect to continue our close working relationship with the government of Mexico. We value the special relationship we have with them and remain committed to working together to advance our mutual economic and security interests.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller. An article at USA Today includes this: when Mexicans elected a new president, they also chose the next negotiator-in-chief who will make tough choices with the United States on issues from immigration and trade to fentanyl trafficking. The author of that story is Lauren Villagran, USA Today national news reporter who covers immigration and the U.S. Mexico border. She joined us now by phone. Thanks for being with us. Before we get to those issues, who is the next president of Mexico? Claudia Sheinbaum.
Yeah, Claudia Sheinbaum was elected the first woman president of Mexico, and she has a really interesting background. She is a trained physicist. She has shared a Nobel Prize, and she holds a doctorate in energy engineering. She was mayor of Mexico City, which is, of course, the sprawling capital of Mexico with 22 million people. And she's a political protege of current President Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
When it comes to the issues you mentioned, immigration, fentanyl trafficking, and trade, what can we expect from her?
You know, I think we're all waiting to find out. You know, López Obrador is her political mentor, and throughout the campaign, she promised Mexican voters that she was going to carry out his agenda. Once she's in office, will she make a departure from some of his policies? We're not gonna know until after October 1 when she's inaugurated into office. That being said, what we know from the way López Obrador has handled the U.S. relationship, it's been very different from years past. You saw a lot of the cooperation on issues of the economy and certainly security fall away. He pulled out of something called the Merida Initiative, which was a $1.5 billion aid package and cooperation package with the United States on drug trafficking and security. And, he was very transactional in his relationship, both with former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. We've seen López Obrador spend most of his time wielding migration as kind of a big stick to get whatever he wants from the United States. Obviously, border crossings are a major issue in the U.S. presidential election. And if they've fallen in recent months, it's in large part thanks to the work that Mexico has been doing. So, will Sheinbaum be able to continue what Mexico has done on immigration? She's going to be inheriting a country with a stressed budget, with very little growth. I think the average is going to be less than 1% over the 6 years that López Obrador was president. And she's going to be in a difficult position.
We're talking with Lauren Villagran from USA Today. Claudia Sheinbaum speaks fluent English. Might she take a different public relations approach than the current president when it comes to the United States?
Yeah, it's probable, Michael. López Obrador is a real wheeling, dealing kind of politician with a lot of charisma and decades of political capital in Mexico. He was very focused on domestic issues and not so much on foreign policy. While she's also supposed to remain focused on domestic issues, she's a technocrat and an academic. And I think we'll probably see a more meticulous and efficiency and practical approach to the U.S. Mexico relationship than we've seen from her predecessor.
There's been a lot of debate in the United States about the fairness of elections. What's the state of Mexican democracy? How did this election go?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We know that this election, which was the biggest that Mexico has ever held, with more than 20,000 positions across the country up for election, including the presidency, their Congress, and governorships and local mayors, et cetera. It was a violent campaign season. You saw more than one candidate assassinated or murdered. There was multiple outbreaks of violence on the campaign trail across Mexico, especially for those more local races. And, I think there was a real question of how a democracy could operate well in that kind of climate. At the same time, Michael, Mexico has a young democracy. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, that ruled for 80 years in Mexico, finally gave up power or changed power in the year 2000. So it is a young democracy. And yet here Mexico is beating the United States in electing a female head of state. And part of the reason for that is that the country has a gender parity law that requires political parties to put forth candidates of both genders and achieve equality. So, there are pros and cons to Mexico's democratic experiment, but, what we saw here yesterday on Sunday was, the first female president of Mexico get elected.
Lauren Villagran, USA Today national news reporter covering immigration and the U.S. Mexico border. You can find her stories at usatoday.com and on X at Lauren Villagran. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Mexico's current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is of the same party as the incoming president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has congratulated her expected win. Writing on X, "With all my affection and respect, I congratulate Claudia Sheinbaum, who came out victorious with an ample margin. She will be the first female president of Mexico, but also the president possibly with most votes obtained in all of the history of our country." Story from Fox News. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says there are gaps between the ceasefire deal Israel proposed and the version of it that President Biden described on Friday. Netanyahu stated Monday that Biden's description of the deal was incomplete, indicating it was less expansive than Biden had suggested. Netanyahu said the proposal that Biden presented is incomplete. The war will stop in order to bring hostages back, and afterward we will hold discussions. There are other details that the U.S. president did not present to the public. Netanyahu went on to say that Israel can stop the war for as long as 6 weeks, but no longer, according to Israeli media. That was from Fox News. This came up today with the White House National Security Communications Coordinator, John Kirby, in an audio briefing.
Why did the president make no mention in Friday's remarks about that Israel remains determined to destroy Hamas? Why does the administration think that Hamas would be willing to agree with that huge Israeli caveat? And what other gaps, as Netanyahu referred to them, are there between the U.S. and Israel? Thank you.
The president has spoken numerous times about the right and responsibility of the Israelis to eliminate the threat that Hamas poses right across their border. Nothing's changed about that. The purpose of the speech was to lay out the details of this recent proposal for a hostage release, a ceasefire, and a potential end to hostilities for the long term. And that was the reason he wanted to lay that out for the American people. But make no mistake, I mean, he remains consistently supportive of Israel's right and responsibility to go after the threat posed by Hamas. I didn't write down all your questions, but I think you asked about why would we think Hamas would go for this? I think I would point you to comments that Hamas leaders themselves made on Friday, which was that they received the president's speech in a positive way. And now they've got this proposal. They got it Thursday night. We're awaiting an official response by them. They ought to take the deal. This gives them what they've been looking for, which is a ceasefire. And over time and through the phases, the potential withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. So they ought to take this deal. It's very forward-leaning, and it's good for the people of Gaza, good for the Israeli people, and they just need to move forward on it. As for the gaps, I don't know what gaps you're referring to. I mean, I've heard different statements coming out of Israel. The Israeli foreign minister himself acknowledged that this was the Israeli proposal, that it was accurately, that it is the Israeli proposal, and we're confident that it accurately reflects that proposal, a proposal that we worked with the Israelis on. So I know of no gaps to speak of.
White House spokesperson John Kirby in an online audio news conference. The White House says that President Biden spoke today with Amir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani of Qatar, and said they confirmed that the comprehensive ceasefire and hostage release deal now on the table offers a concrete roadmap for ending the crisis in Gaza. The president confirmed Israel's readiness to move forward with the terms that have now been offered to Hamas. He urged Amir Tamim to use all appropriate measures to secure Hamas's acceptance of the deal and affirmed that Hamas is now the only obstacle to a complete ceasefire and relief for the people of Gaza. That was the readout from the White House about the phone call. Also today, UNRWA, the main United Nations relief agency in Gaza, says that more than 1 million people have fled Rafah in southern Gaza in the weeks since Israel issued evacuation orders. From Associated Press, South Korea announced Monday it'll suspend a rapprochement deal with North Korea to punish it over its launches of trash-carrying balloons, even after the North said it would halt its balloon campaign. Over several days, North Korea flew hundreds of balloons to drop trash and manure on South Korea in an angry reaction against previous South Korean civilian leafleting campaigns. On Sunday, South Korea said it would take unbearable retaliatory steps in response before North Korea abruptly announced it would stop flying balloons across the border. That was from Associated Press. The South Korean ambassador to the UN, Jungkook Hwang, was asked about this at a news conference at the UN.
We just heard the news, and these days, and over the last over the last several days alone, North Korea engaged in the provocations, major provocations, including multiple short-range ballistic missile tests and also military reconnaissance tests, and sending bizarre balloons filled with trash, and so on. And we are now responding. We respond firmly to North Korean provocations, including the Security Council meeting we participated last week. And we stand ready to convene a meeting of the Security Council anytime in response to the provocations by the DPRK.
The South Korean ambassador to the United Nations, Jungkook Hwang, at the UN in New York City, part of a news conference that was called because South Korea has the United Nations Security Council presidency for the month of June. Story from Voice of America. Vice President Kamala Harris and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan will attend a Ukraine peace conference in Switzerland on June 15th, the White House said in a statement on Monday. Harris will travel to Switzerland to underscore Washington's commitment to supporting Ukraine's effort to secure a just and lasting peace based on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and the principles of the UN Charter, the Vice President's Communications Director, Kirsten Allen, said. That was from Voice of America. Jake Sullivan was interviewed today by Liz Schreier, President and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, at the group's forum in Washington, D.C. And one question she asked was about plans for a second Joe Biden presidential term.
I know you're here representing the administration and not the president's campaign. However, I also know that you are an architect of the administration's foreign policy, and you know the president pretty well. So maybe you could speculate. If the president were to win re-election, how might you think a second Biden administration would see foreign policy, prioritize foreign policy, particularly around development and diplomacy? Same? Change? Different? What do you think?
One thing I would like to see, and it goes back to where I don't think we've gone as far as we could go, is a major initiative with the Congress aimed at truly delivering on the promise of unlocking resources for the developing world. And that has a few elements to it. There's actually resourcing the MDB reform effort, actually resourcing the debt relief dimension, actually resourcing these what we call corridors. You'll hear more about this from Amos Hochstein, where we're trying to identify places in the world where we can put together infrastructure, agriculture, energy, digital technology, and we've got the Lobito corridor running across southern Africa. We just announced a major corridor in Luzon in the Philippines. We have this concept, if we can bring the war in Gaza to a close, of a corridor from India across the Middle East all the way to Europe, and we're looking for more of that. That requires a coherent set of resources that has just a different and more dynamic theory of how you generate development, economic growth, stability, and I think the sky's the limit on it. I mean, the Lobito corridor, for example, the idea that we can not only build out a transportation capacity to help ensure that we have the inputs for our clean energy supply chains, but also unlock Africa's vast agricultural potential by getting goods to market, and also unlock a digital transformation across that area. That is all totally available to us. It doesn't require new ideas. It doesn't require some, major political shift. It requires resources and prioritization, and that will be a major focus of ours in the second term when it comes to development. It is a vision of how the United States can mobilize just a different magnitude of resources to get after these challenges, and we're going to need help from the Congress to do that.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan interviewed at a forum in Washington hosted by the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter Word for Word and get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.